Most people believe they're fully awake because their eyes open every morning. They go to work, pay their bills, chase their goals, and follow routines that have become as familiar as breathing. But that's not true awakening. That's simply existing inside a pattern that's been repeated so many times that questioning it feels almost impossible. It's easy to confuse movement with progress and activity with purpose. Many people spend their entire lives rushing from one obligation to another without ever stopping long enough to ask themselves whether they're actually living the life they chose or simply carrying out a script that someone else wrote for them years ago. This is the way it is for most people, and they don't even realize it. But the frightening reality is that most of us inherit our beliefs before we're old enough to examine them. We inherit opinions, traditions, fears, expectations, and definitions of success from family, society, schools, media, and every institution that surrounds us. Before we can think independently, we're already being told who we're supposed to become. By the time we reach adulthood, those borrowed ideas feel so natural that we mistake them for our own. That's why genuine self-discovery is rare. It requires tearing down walls that we've spent a lifetime believing were protecting us. I've learned that truth has a way of making people uncomfortable because truth refuses to flatter our illusions. It doesn't care about our feelings, our popularity, or our carefully crafted public image. It simply stands there waiting for us to either embrace it or run away from it. Most people choose the second option because illusions often feel safer than reality. Comfort has become one of the greatest addictions of modern life, and many would rather protect a comfortable lie than confront an uncomfortable truth. That's why real awakening isn't some mystical experience reserved for a chosen few. It's a decision. It's the willingness to examine everything you've accepted without question. It's having enough courage to ask whether your ambitions are truly yours, whether your fears belong to you, and whether the life you're building reflects your own convictions or someone else's expectations. That process is not glamorous, and it certainly isn't easy. In fact, it often feels like watching your entire worldview collapse one brick at a time. The strange thing about awakening is that it doesn't begin by revealing the world. It begins by revealing yourself. Before you can recognize deception around you, you must first recognize the deception you've practiced within yourself. Every excuse you've accepted, every compromise you've justified, every mask you've worn to gain acceptance eventually demands your attention. That's where transformation begins, not by changing everyone around you, but by refusing to keep lying to yourself. One of the greatest victories ever achieved by systems of control wasn't convincing people to obey. It was convincing people that constant distraction equals freedom. Everywhere you look, we're surrounded by endless entertainment, endless arguments, endless trends, endless breaking news, and endless reasons to keep our attention focused everywhere except where it matters most. A distracted mind rarely questions anything deeply because it's too busy chasing the next emotional reaction. I've noticed that people today consume information at a pace that leaves very little room for reflection. Headlines replace understanding. Opinions replace investigation. Viral moments replace wisdom. Everyone has something to say, yet very few take the time to understand what they're talking about. We've created a culture where speed is rewarded more than depth, and noise is often mistaken for knowledge. That's exactly how manipulation survives. When people never pause long enough to think critically, and they become easy to guide without ever realizing they've been led. It's amazing how easy people surrender their peace for temporary excitement. Every notification demands attention. Every controversy demands a reaction. Every trend insists that you participate before it's replaced by the next one. This constant cycle keeps people emotionally exhausted while convincing them they're staying informed. But information without understanding isn't wisdom. It's simply another form of mental clutter. That's why distraction has become one of the most powerful forces shaping modern society. It's difficult to control someone who's thinking independently, but it's much easier to influence someone whose attention is constantly divided. A mind that's always reacting rarely has time to examine why it's reacting in the first place. That's exactly why silence has become so uncomfortable for many people. The moment external noise disappears, internal questions begin to surface. Those quiet moments are often the ones people avoid the most. They immediately reach for another video, another conversation, another social media feed, another television program, or another task to fill the space in silence. But it's inside those moments of stillness that life's deepest questions begin to emerge. Who are you when no one is watching? What truly matters to you? What have you accepted without examination? Those questions can't be answered while your mind is constantly racing toward the next distraction. Many people imagine prisons as buildings surrounded by steel bars and locked gates. Yet the strongest prisons often have no visible walls at all. They're constructed inside the human mind through fear, conditioning, social pressure, and the desperate need to belong. Once those invisible walls are accepted, very few people ever attempt to escape because they no longer recognize they're confined. Fear has always been one of the most effective tools of control. Fear of rejection convinces people to remain silent when they know something is wrong. Fear of failure keeps them from pursuing dreams that challenge convention. Fear of criticism encourages conformity, while fear of loneliness pressures people into maintaining relationships, careers, and lifestyles that quietly drain their spirit. Over time, those fears become so familiar that they begin to feel normal. I've seen countless people proudly defend situations that are clearly limiting them because they've confused familiarity with freedom. They cling to routines that no longer serve them simply because those routines feel predictable. They protect beliefs they've never honestly examined because questioning them might require uncomfortable change. They continue performing roles they've long outgrown because they're terrified of discovering who they might become without them. That's when awakening begins to separate itself from mere knowledge. It's one thing to recognize that invisible prisons exist. It's something entirely different to admit you've been living inside of one all along. That realization demands humility because it forces you to acknowledge that you weren't as free as you once believed. Many people never reach that point because admitting you've been deceived can be very, very painful. But refusing to acknowledge deception only guarantees that it continues. Real freedom doesn't begin when society grants permission. It begins the moment you refuse to surrender ownership of your own mind. That's a freedom nobody can give you. And it's also one nobody can take away unless you willingly hand it over. Once you understand that, you begin viewing life differently. You stop chasing approval quite so desperately because you realize approval has often been the currency used to purchase your obedience. The greatest journey you'll ever take isn't across oceans or continents. It's the journey from unconscious living to conscious awareness. Everything changes once that journey begins. The questions become deeper. The observations become sharper. The illusions become easier to recognize. And although that path can sometimes feel lonely, it also leads to a level of freedom that no amount of material success can ever provide. One of the greatest discoveries a person can make isn't about the world around them. It's about the person staring back from the mirror every single morning. Most people believe they're showing the world who they really are. But if we're honest with ourselves, most of us have spent years creating versions of ourselves that we hope others will accept. We smile when we're hurting. We agree when we disagree. We stay quiet when our spirit is screaming to speak. Little by little, the mask becomes so comfortable that we eventually forget we're wearing it. That's when pretending stops being something we do and becomes someone we are. I've noticed that people spend enormous amounts of energy protecting an image that doesn't even represent their authentic selves. They carefully choose words that won't offend, opinions that won't isolate them, and behaviors that won't threaten the approval they've worked so hard to earn. Every decision becomes another brick in a false identity that must constantly be maintained. It's exhausting, to be honest. Yet many people never question whether the performance is worth the cost because they've been applauded for acting instead of living. That's why awakening feels so unsettling. It forces you to confront every version of yourself that was built to satisfy someone else's expectations. It asks uncomfortable questions that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If no one applauded you, who would you become? If no one criticized you, what would you pursue? If no one expected anything from you, how would you choose to live? Those questions expose the difference between genuine identity and carefully managed appearances. The world teaches us to admire confidence, but much of what passes for confidence is simply fear wearing expensive clothes. Many people speak loudly because they're terrified of being ignored. I know a couple of people like that. They can't keep the damn mouth shut. They babble and they babble and they babble, but I understand what it is. Others collect titles, possessions, and accomplishments because they're desperate to convince themselves they're valuable. Some constantly seek attention because silence forces them to face insecurities they've successfully avoided. External success can become nothing more than a sophisticated hiding place for internal uncertainty. How about that? That's why true awakening doesn't make you obsessed with appearances. It makes you increasingly indifferent to them. You begin caring less about being impressive and more about being authentic. You stop asking how you've been perceived and start asking whether you're living honestly. That's a much harder question to answer because honesty often demands sacrifices that popularity never will. Human beings naturally desire connection. There's nothing wrong with wanting companionship, community, and acceptance. Those desires help us build meaningful relationships and support one another through life's challenges. The problem begins when belonging becomes more important than truth. That's when people start abandoning their convictions just to avoid standing alone. History has repeatedly shown that crowds aren't always right. Entire societies have embraced ideas that later generations recognized as destructive, cruel, or deeply misguided. Yet while those ideas were popular, questioning them often carried enormous consequences. That's the pressure conformity places on every generation. It whispers that agreement is safer than honesty and that fitting in matters more than thinking independently. I've learned that people often confuse agreement with peace. They remain silent during conversations that trouble them because speaking honestly might create tension. They suppress questions because questioning accepted beliefs makes others uncomfortable. They ignore warning signs because acknowledging them would require difficult choices. On the surface, everything appears calm. Beneath that surface, however, something much more dangerous is taking place. Personal integrity slowly begins to erode. That's the trade-off. That's why awakening often creates distance between you and people you've known for years. It's not because you've become arrogant or believe that you're better than anybody else. It's because your priorities have changed. Conversations that once entertained you begin to feel empty. Endless gossip becomes exhausting. Constant complaining without personal responsibility loses its appeal. You don't necessarily reject people, you simply stop feeding habits that no longer nourish your spirit. Some people will misunderstand that change completely. They'll assume you become distant, judgmental, or cold. In reality, you simply become more intentional with your attention. You recognize that where your focus goes, your life follows. That's why you become increasingly protective of your time, your peace, and your influences you allow into your mind. You're no longer interested in filling every quiet moment with noise simply because everyone else does. One of the most difficult lessons awakening teaches is that actions often have deeper motivations than appearance suggests. That realization doesn't mean everyone is dishonest or malicious. It simply means human beings are far more complicated than we usually admit. People rarely operate from one single motive. Love can exist alongside fear. Kindness can exist alongside insecurity. Generosity can sometimes be mixed with the desire for recognition. Understanding that complexity changes the way you observe human behavior. I've come to realize that listening carefully often reveals far more than speaking constantly ever could. People's words tell part of the story, but their actions usually tell the rest. Patterns become easier to recognize when you stop focusing on promises alone. You notice consistency. You notice contradictions. You notice whether someone's private behavior matches their public image. Those observations become far more valuable than emotional reactions. Awakening teaches patience because the truth usually reveals itself over time. Many people rush to place complete trust in someone after hearing beautiful words or witnessing impressive performances. But wisdom develops differently. It waits. It observes. It allows time to expose character. Eventually, what someone genuinely values becomes impossible to hide because every decision leaves a trail. That's why emotionally mature people aren't easily manipulated by charm alone. They've learned that appearances can be carefully crafted while intentions remain hidden. They understand that impressive speeches mean very little without consistent actions to support them. Instead of becoming cynical, they've become discerning. There's a tremendous difference between those two mindsets. Cynicism assumes the worst about everyone. Discernment simply refuses to ignore what experience has already taught. When your perception sharpens, you stop reacting to every emotional performance presented before you. You begin asking different questions. Why is this message being promoted so aggressively? Who benefits if I believe this? Why am I being encouraged to feel fear instead of understanding? Those questions don't make you suspicious of everything. They make you responsible for your own thinking. Perhaps the greatest surprise awaiting every awakened person is discovering that the most important battle isn't taking place in society at all. It's taking place inside themselves. It's easy to identify hypocrisy in others while overlooking it within our own hearts. It's easy to criticize manipulation while quietly manipulating circumstances for our own benefit. It's easy to expose pride while secretly feeding our own ego. That's why genuine awakening always turns inward before it reaches outward. Every human being carries strengths alongside weaknesses, compassion alongside selfishness, courage alongside fear. Pretending otherwise doesn't eliminate those realities. It simply hides them beneath another layer of denial. Growth begins when we're willing to acknowledge every part of ourselves without allowing our flaws to define us. That's a difficult balance because honesty requires humility, and humility isn't something our culture often celebrates. I've found that people who constantly present themselves as perfect usually spend enormous energy protecting that illusion. They become defensive whenever they're challenged because admitting mistakes threatens the identity they created. Truly mature people operate differently. They recognize that admitting weakness isn't failure, it's the beginning of transformation. You can't heal what you refuse to acknowledge. Understand that. The world encourages us to defeat others while neglecting the work required to master ourselves. Yet self-mastery remains one of the greatest victories any person can achieve. Learning to control anger without suppressing it, learning to experience disappointment without surrendering hope, learning to feel fear without allowing fear to dictate every decision. Those victories rarely receive public applause, but they quietly reshape an entire life. As this journey continues, something remarkable begins to happen. You become less interested in winning arguments and more interested in understanding reality. You stop measuring success by applause and start measuring it by integrity. The opinions of strangers gradually lose their power because you've discovered something far more valuable than acceptance. You've begun developing a relationship with truth that no amount of criticism can destroy. Once that foundation is established, the world no longer determines your identity because you've stopped allowing the crowd to define who you are. One of the greatest signs of awakening isn't that you suddenly know all the answers. It's that you stop feeling obligated to react to everything that demands your attention. That's a difficult lesson because we are living in a world that constantly pulls at our emotions. Every headline is designed to provoke us. Every controversy invites us to choose sides before we've had time to think. Every disagreement becomes a contest to see who can shout the loudest. Somewhere along the way, we've mistaken emotional reaction for genuine strength. I've discovered that emotional discipline is one of the rarest forms of power a person can possess. It's easy to explode in anger when someone insults you. It's easy to panic when life becomes uncertain. It's easy to become consumed with worry when circumstances don't unfold according to your plans. But real strength isn't found in emotional outbursts. It's revealed in the ability to remain centered while everything around you seems determined to throw you off balance. That's the difference between someone who is ruled by circumstances and someone who has learned to rule themselves. People often assume that remaining calm means you've stopped caring. Nothing could be further from the truth. Emotional detachment doesn't mean becoming cold, distant, or indifferent. It means refusing to let temporary emotions become permanent decisions. It means understanding that feelings are real, but they aren't always reliable. Anger can cloud judgment. Fear can exaggerate danger. Excitement can hide risk. That's why the awakened person learns to experience emotions without becoming imprisoned by them. When your peace depends on everyone agreeing with you, you'll never know peace. When your confidence depends on constant praise, you'll forever be searching for another compliment. When your happiness depends on external conditions remaining perfect, disappointment becomes unavoidable. Awakening teaches a different way of living. It reminds us that stability begins inside long before it ever appears outside. That's why emotionally grounded people become so difficult to manipulate. Those who understand themselves aren't easily controlled through fear, guilt, flattery, or intimidation. They listen before reacting. They observe before deciding. They refuse to surrender their judgment simply because everyone else has become emotional. That quiet discipline becomes one of the strongest forms of freedom a human being can possess. Many people spend their entire lives chasing something that can never fully satisfy them. They chase approval from strangers who don't truly know them. They seek recognition from people who may never genuinely appreciate them. They build their identity around applause that's here today and forgotten tomorrow. It's a painful cycle because validation has no finish line. The more you receive, the more you begin depending on it. I've watched people completely transform themselves just to gain acceptance from groups that would quickly replace them if they disappeared tomorrow. They'll hide their convictions, silence their questions, and even compromise their integrity because the fear of rejection feels greater than the pain of pretending. That's a dangerous bargain because every compromise creates another layer separating you from your authentic self. The awakened mind begins asking a different question altogether. Instead of asking, "How can I make everyone like me?" it asks, "Am I living in a way that allows me to respect myself?" Those two questions lead in completely different directions. One produces performance, the other produces authenticity. One depends on public opinion, the other depends on personal integrity. There's something incredibly liberating about reaching the point where criticism no longer destroys you and compliments no longer define you. You become grateful for encouragement without becoming addicted to it. You learn from constructive criticism without allowing it to steal your identity. You finally understand that your value existed long before anyone applauded you, and it'll continue to exist long after the applause fades away. That's not arrogance. It's emotional independence. It's recognizing that your purpose can't be measured by popularity, and your character can't be determined by the opinions of people who only see fragments of your life. Once that realization settles into your spirit, you stop exhausting yourself trying to satisfy expectations that were never yours to carry in the first place. Our society has become deeply uncomfortable with silence. Every quiet moment is quickly filled with music, podcasts, notifications, conversations, or endless scrolling. Many people fear silence because silence removes distractions. It leaves us alone with our thoughts, our unresolved questions, and the truths that we work so hard to avoid. I've come to appreciate silence in a completely different way. It's in those quiet moments that life begins speaking with remarkable clarity. Without the constant noise of outside influence, you begin noticing patterns you overlooked before. You recognize habits that have quietly shaped your decisions for years. You become aware of fears you've disguised as practical thinking. More importantly, you begin hearing your authentic voice instead of the thousands of competing voices demanding your attention every single day. Silence also teaches patience. In a culture obsessed with instant answers, waiting has become almost unbearable. We want immediate solutions, immediate success, immediate healing, immediate understanding. But some lessons refuse to be rushed. Wisdom matters slowly. Discernment develops through observation. Character grows through perseverance. Those gifts cannot be downloaded overnight, no matter how desperately we wish they could. That's why periods of solitude shouldn't automatically be mistaken for loneliness. Solitude can become one of life's greatest classrooms when approached with intention. It's during these seasons that we discover who we are apart from constant influence. We learn what genuinely matters to us. We separate inherited beliefs from personal convictions. We begin building an inner foundation capable of withstanding external storms. The awakened person eventually understands that silence isn't empty. It's full of opportunity. It's where clarity grows, where purpose becomes sharper, and where distractions gradually lose their grip. Those who refuse to spend time alone often remain strangers to themselves. Those who embrace thoughtful solitude often emerge with a confidence that no crowd could ever provide. Fear has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as wisdom. It tells people that they're simply being realistic when they're actually surrendering dreams they were born to pursue. It convinces them to remain trapped in unhealthy environments because at least those environments feel familiar. It whispers that safety is always better than uncertainty, even when safety slowly becomes another word for stagnation. I've learned that fear doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it appears quietly through hesitation, procrastination, self-doubt, or endless excuses. It persuades people to postpone meaningful change until some imaginary perfect moment finally arrives. The problem is that perfection never comes. Life continues moving while fear keeps promising that tomorrow will somehow provide the courage we refuse to develop today. Awakening changes that relationship with fear. You begin recognizing it without automatically obeying it. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is deciding that truth deserves your loyalty more than comfort does. Every meaningful transformation requires walking through uncertainty. Every significant breakthrough demands leaving something familiar behind. That's never easy, but it's often necessary. When fear no longer controls your decisions, manipulation begins losing its power over you. Threats become less intimidating because your convictions have become stronger than your anxieties. False promises lose their appeal because you've stopped looking for shortcuts around life's essential work. You no longer chase every opportunity simply because it promises comfort. Instead, you carefully examine whether it aligns with your values and purpose. Freedom isn't found in a world where nothing ever challenges you. Freedom is discovered when challenges no longer determine who you've become. It's the quiet confidence of knowing that no matter what circumstances arise, your integrity remains intact. That's a level of strength no one can purchase, borrow, or fake. It's earned through countless moments of choosing principle over convenience, truth over illusion, and growth over comfort. As this journey continues, another realization begins taking shape. The more clearly you see the world, the less interested you become in controlling everyone around you. Instead, your focus shifts toward mastering the only life you've ever truly been given to govern, your own. That's where awakening becomes more than a philosophy. It becomes a way of living that quietly transforms every decision, every relationship, and every step forward. There comes a point on the journey toward awakening where you begin to realize that knowledge isn't always celebrated. In fact, some of the deepest truths you'll ever discover may separate you from people you once considered inseparable. That's one of the hardest realities to accept because we've been taught that truth naturally brings people together. Sometimes it does, but just as often, truth exposes the invisible distance that was already there. I've learned that many relationships aren't built upon honesty as much as they're built upon mutual comfort. As long as everyone agrees to avoid difficult conversations, the relationship appears healthy. As long as uncomfortable questions remain unasked, everything remains peaceful and will feel peaceful. But the moment one person begins searching for deeper understanding, the balance begins to shift. Suddenly, the conversations that once felt meaningful seem strangely hollow. Interests that once connected you no longer carry the same weight. You haven't necessarily changed into someone unrecognizable. You've simply outgrown conversations that no longer nourish your spirit. That's why awakening can feel so lonely. It isn't because you've stopped loving people. It's because you've stopped pretending that superficial connections are enough. You begin craving sincerity instead of performance. You seek substance instead of appearances. You value thoughtful dialogue more than endless entertainment. Those priorities naturally reshape your relationships, sometimes in beautiful ways and sometimes in painful ones. People often misunderstand this season. They'll accuse you of becoming distant, difficult, and overly serious. They may wonder why you no longer enjoy the distractions that once consumed your attention. They may even interpret your quietness as a judgment when in reality, you're simply learning to protect your peace. Not every battle deserves your energy. Not every argument deserves your response. Not every invitation deserves your presence. There's an incredible freedom in reaching the point where you are no longer afraid of walking alone. Solitude stops feeling like rejection and begins feeling like preparation. Instead of fearing empty spaces in your life, you begin recognizing them as opportunities for growth. You discover that being alone and being lonely aren't the same experience. One weakens the spirit, the other often strengthens it. Truth has a remarkable way of exposing everything we've worked so hard to hide. It shines light into places we'd rather keep in darkness. It challenges habits we've defended for years. It questions assumptions we've mistaken for certainty. That's why so many people instinctively resist it. It's not always because they're dishonest. Often, it's because truth demands change, and change threatens familiarity. I've noticed that people generally don't become angry simply because they hear something new. They become angry when new information challenges the identity they've built around old beliefs. That's an entirely different experience. When deeply held assumptions begin to crumble, it can feel as though part of the self is collapsing alongside them. No wonder so many choose denial instead of reflection. Denial is often less painful in the moment, even though it creates greater suffering in the long run. That's why wisdom requires compassion. Once you begin seeing things more clearly, it becomes tempting to grow impatient with those who haven't reached the same conclusions. But awakening isn't a competition. Every person is moving through life according to experiences, lessons, and timing that are uniquely their own. Just because someone isn't ready to hear a particular truth today doesn't mean they'll never discover it tomorrow. I've learned that forcing truth upon unwilling ears rarely produces transformation. More often, it creates resistance. People must arrive at certain realizations through their own experiences. We can offer perspective, share insight, and live by example. But genuine awakening cannot be imposed from the outside. It grows from within, often through moments of struggle, disappointment, and deep personal reflection. That realization changes the way you communicate. You stop feeling responsible for convincing everyone. You begin understanding that your greatest testimony isn't found in endless arguments. It's found in the consistency of your own life. Quiet integrity often speaks more powerfully than loud opinions ever could. One of the greatest dangers on the path toward awareness is confusing clarity with cynicism. As you begin recognizing manipulation, deception, and selfishness more easily, it's possible to become disillusioned with humanity itself. Every conversation begins feeling suspicious. Every act of kindness appears calculated. Every institution seems corrupt beyond repair. If we are not careful, awakening can slowly transform into bitterness disguised as wisdom. I've seen people reach this crossroads. They become so focused on exposing darkness that they lose the ability to recognize light. Their perception becomes sharp, but their compassion grows weak. They pride themselves on seeing through every illusion while quietly becoming imprisoned by hopelessness. That's not freedom. That's simply another form of captivity. Real awakening produces discernment without destroying compassion. It allows you to recognize human weakness without forgetting human potential. It reminds you that every person carries both admirable qualities and painful flaws. The goal isn't to pretend darkness doesn't exist. The goal is refusing to let darkness define your entire understanding of life. I've discovered that the strongest people aren't those who never experience disappointment. They're the ones who continue choosing integrity after disappointment. They continue extending grace after betrayal. They continue believing in growth after failure. That doesn't make them naive. It makes them resilient. They've learned that protecting their heart doesn't require hardening it. The world desperately needs people who can see clearly without becoming cruel. It needs individuals who refuse to participate in deception without surrendering hope. That's a difficult balance to maintain, but it's also one of the clearest signs of genuine maturity. Truth without compassion becomes harsh. Compassion without truth becomes weakness. Awakening teaches us to carry both. Eventually, something extraordinary begins happening within you. The need to constantly prove yourself starts disappearing. You stop measuring your worth by accomplishments alone. You stop chasing every opportunity simply because it promises recognition. Your life becomes less about impressing others and more about remaining faithful to your own principles. I've come to believe that real sovereignty has very little to do with external authority. It begins the moment you stop allowing fear, approval, anger, or insecurity to govern your decisions. That's genuine self-government. That's where lasting freedom is born. No title can give it to you, and no criticism can take it away. The world often encourages people to conquer others before they've learned to master themselves. We celebrate influence while neglecting character. We admire visibility while overlooking integrity. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that those who cannot govern their own desires eventually become prisoners of them. Power without self-control always carries the seeds of its own destruction. Inner sovereignty looks remarkably ordinary from the outside. It's the quiet confidence that doesn't require constant attention. It's the discipline to remain truthful when deception would be easier. It's the strength to remain humble when success arrives and to remain hopeful when adversity appears. Those qualities rarely make headlines, but they shape extraordinary lives. As your foundation grows stronger, external chaos begins losing its ability to shake you. Circumstances still change, challenges still appear, loss still hurts, but your identity is no longer built upon temporary conditions. It's anchored in something much deeper than public opinion or changing circumstances. That's when you realize awakening was never about escaping the world. It was about learning how to stand firmly within it without becoming consumed by it. The further you travel along this road, the clearer one truth becomes. Freedom isn't found by controlling everyone around you. It's discovered by refusing to surrender control of yourself. That's the beginning of genuine sovereignty, and once you've experienced it, no illusion can fully satisfy you again. There comes a moment when you finally understand that awakening was never about becoming superior to anyone else. It was never about collecting secret knowledge or separating yourself from humanity. It's about becoming impossible to deceive because you first stopped deceiving yourself. That's a freedom that no government can legislate, no institution can manufacture, and no critic can destroy. It begins quietly, deep within your own conscience, where truth becomes more valuable than comfort and integrity becomes more important than image. I've discovered that the strongest people in this world aren't always the loudest voices or the most celebrated names. They're often the men and women who have learned to govern themselves. They don't waste precious energy trying to dominate every conversation or control every outcome. They understand that life isn't a contest of egos, but a continual process of refinement. Every disappointment becomes a lesson. Every betrayal becomes discernment. Every setback becomes another opportunity to build unshakable character. While others become bitter, they become wiser. While others become fearful, they become more deliberate. Awakening also teaches us something the modern world desperately needs to remember. Real strength doesn't come from pretending to have no weaknesses. It comes from facing those weaknesses honestly and refusing to let them dictate the direction of your life. Every one of us carries scars, insecurities, regrets, and unanswered questions. The difference isn't whether those things exist. The difference is whether we allow them to imprison us or inspire us to become something greater. The awakened person chooses growth over excuses, responsibility over blame, and truth over illusion every single time. That's why genuine freedom can never be purchased. It isn't hidden inside a bank account, a prestigious title, or the applause of strangers. Those things may provide temporary comfort, but they cannot give lasting peace. Peace arrives when your inner life no longer depends upon the approval of the outside world. It grows when your principles remain steady regardless of changing trends. It deepens when your confidence comes from knowing who you are instead of constantly asking others to tell you. That's the kind of wealth that survives every economic collapse and every shifting season of life. Many people spend their entire existence searching for someone to rescue them. They're waiting for the perfect leader, the perfect relationship, the perfect opportunity, or the perfect moment to finally begin living. Awakening destroys that illusion. It reminds us that the greatest transformation begins the instant we accept complete responsibility for our own minds, our own decisions, and our own character. Nobody can walk the road for us. Others may encourage us, inspire us, or challenge us, but every meaningful step must ultimately be taken by our own feet. Once you've tasted clarity, life never returns to what it was before. You begin noticing things that once escaped your attention. You become more intentional with your words because you understand that language shapes reality. You become more protective of your peace because you've learned how easily unnecessary conflict steals your energy. You become more selective about what enters your mind because you recognize that every influence leaves a fingerprint on your thinking. I've learned that the greatest victories often happen where no audience is watching. They happen when you choose honesty, even though deception would be easier. They happen when you remain calm while others surrender to panic. They happen when you forgive without forgetting the lesson, love without surrendering your dignity, and continue walking with purpose despite misunderstandings or criticism. Those quiet victories slowly transform the soul until strength becomes part of your nature instead of something you struggle to imitate. There will always be voices demanding your attention. There will always be distractions competing for your focus. There will always be people who insist that comfort is more valuable than truth. But once your eyes have opened, those voices begin losing their authority. You no longer feel obligated to chase every trend or defend yourself against every opinion. You understand that a life built upon conviction doesn't require constant explanation. The awakened life isn't free from hardship. If anything, it often brings greater responsibility. You become accountable for what you now understand. You can no longer hide behind ignorance or blame everyone else for your circumstances. That's a heavy burden, but it's also an extraordinary privilege. Responsibility gives birth to freedom because it places the steering wheel of your own life back into your own hands. When you reach this place, something remarkable happens. You stop waiting for permission to become the person you were always capable of being. You stop asking the crowd to validate your purpose. You stop apologizing for choosing peace over chaos and truth over popularity. You finally realize that your greatest assignment has never been to impress the world. It's been to live so authentically that your very existence becomes a quiet testimony to what's possible when a person refuses to remain asleep. The world may never understand your journey, and that's okay. It's perfectly fine. It doesn't have to. Your responsibility isn't to convince everyone else you're awakened. Your responsibility is to keep your own eyes open. Every day presents another opportunity to think more clearly, love more deeply, speak more honestly, and live more intentionally than you did yesterday. That's how lasting transformation happens, not through one dramatic moment, but through thousands of faithful decisions made when no one else is paying attention. One day, you'll look back and realize that the greatest miracle wasn't escaping the world's illusions. The greatest miracle was discovering that the key to your freedom had been inside you all along. The prison door was never locked. The chains were never stronger than your willingness to break them. The only thing standing between the life you were living and the life you were created to live was the courage to finally open your eyes. The greatest revolution you'll ever lead won't happen in the streets, inside a courtroom, or beside the walls of a government building. It'll happen within your own mind. That's where every chain is first forged, and that's where every chain is first broken. Once you understand that, you'll stop waiting for someone else to hand you freedom, because you'll recognize that freedom begins with the way you choose to think. The world will continue offering distractions disguised as fulfillment and illusions disguised as success. It'll continue rewarding appearances while often overlooking substance. Don't allow that to discourage you. Every generation has faced its own versions of deception. What matters isn't how convincing the illusion becomes. What matters is whether you're willing to keep searching for truth, even when truth demands something difficult from you. Never confuse standing alone with standing wrong. History has repeatedly shown that those willing to think independently are often misunderstood before they're appreciated. Don't measure your progress by the size of the crowd walking beside you. Measure it by the peace you've developed within yourself and the integrity that guides your decisions when no one is watching. If there's one lesson I hope you carry with you after listening to these words, it's this. Don't fear awakening simply because it may cost you comfort. Fear remaining asleep because comfort without truth is merely another form of captivity. The temporary pain of seeing clearly will always be worth more than the lifelong comfort of living inside a beautiful illusion. So I leave you with one final challenge. Slow down, become still, question what you've been taught, examine what you've accepted. Protect your peace, guard your mind, strengthen your character. Above all else, never stop seeking truth, because the moment you choose truth over illusion is the moment you stop merely existing and finally begin to live. Thank you so much for being here with me. I hope you appreciate these words. Much love to you all. On to the next one. LanceScurv out. And as always, peace.